Hello, my name is Anne Wang and I'm a teaching artist with the Houston Center for Photography. Today's topic for Levy Park Photography Workshop is landscapes. I hope you will enjoy it and take this opportunity to go outdoors while respecting social distancing guidelines. Today we will talk about landscapes, and I will first review some simple composition techniques that are quite effective in landscape photography. Composition was covered in depth in our first and second Levy Park workshops. Then I will talk about camera setting and accessories for landscape photography. And I will close today's workshop with focusing and hyperfocal distance focusing. First, composition. So composition is the art of seeing and arranging the visual elements within the photograph for a deliberate effect. It can make your photograph more appealing and powerful, helping the image to tell a visual story. Positioning the subject or important elements of the image, such as the horizon, in the middle of the frame can make the image look too static. The best way around this is to use the rule of thirds to position elements in a more pleasing way, arranging them off-center. It will give your photographs a feeling of flow and depth, as well as helping them look balanced, creating an easy path for the eye of the viewer to move around the image. For the rule of thirds, you will divide the frame into 9 equal segments by using 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines, and you will position the most important elements in your scene along these lines or at the points where they intersect. Here Chris Burkhardt decided to place the truck on the vertical line of third on the right-hand side. And he used also the bottom line of third to place the horizon, emphasizing then the great interest that we have in the sky and the color of the clouds, and their shape as well. However, you can notice that here we also have a reflection. And scenes containing reflections are also a great opportunity to use symmetry in your composition. And this is shown here in this image. This image mixes the rule of thirds and symmetry to compose the scene. The tree is positioned off-center to the right of the frame, but the perfectly still water of the lake provides the symmetry on the horizontal axis. A symmetrical shot with strong composition and a good point of interest can lead to a striking image, but without the strong point of interest, it can be a little predictable. Here the tree serves as a good point of interest. This is a wonderful image by Chris Burkhardt that uses reflection and symmetry. Symmetry here is both on the horizontal and vertical axis. However, Chris also added a man-made point of interest in the foreground of the image with the colorful kayaker. Make sure also that you fill the frame with what is significant and capture only that, which is what Chris does here. Leading lines help draw the eye into the image and focus the viewer's attention on the main subject. They are also an excellent means of creating depth and symmetry, as shown in this image by Jan Arthus Bertrand. They can be used to create powerful images with a strong visual impact. In this image, the leading lines, pattern, and symmetry create a well-balanced image. The tree adds a sense of scale to the image, as well as being a point of interest. Human beings are naturally attracted to patterns. They are visually attractive and suggest harmony. We are surrounded by symmetry and patterns, born natural and man-made. They can make for very eye-catching compositions, particularly in situations where they are not expected. Another great way to use them is to break the symmetry of pattern in some way, introducing tension and a focal point into the scene. In Arthus Bertrand's image, the green island in the center is breaking the pattern and adding interest. The viewpoint from which this image was taken is also very interesting. It was taken from far above, maybe from the top of a mountain or a cliff. Like color, texture can draw people into a photograph and create visual interest. Texture adds visual weight to items in photographs, depth and a sense of touch. It is important to use side light in order not to lose the depth of the texture. Texture is just more interesting and our eyes are drawn to it. Here the light accentuates the ripples in the sand dunes. This is another sand dunes image from Sebastião Salgado to remind you to shoot both portrait and landscape, even in landscape photography. This is an interesting image by Brett Weston, who was the second son of photographer Edward Weston. The way the light falls on this landscape, it brings out the texture not only in the rocks, but also into the grass and the tree. Using natural frames is a trick that will isolate your subject from the rest of the image, leading the viewer's eyes straight to the place you want it to go. But you need to make sure that the frame is going to add to the image and not be a distraction. You can use framing to add context to a photograph, for example, an architecture of the archway, or giving a sense of depth to the image and layers, like in this image in front of us. Depth. Because photography is a two-dimensional medium, we have to choose our composition carefully to convey the sense of depth that was present in the actual scene. You can create depth in a photo by including objects in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Here Ansel Adam chose to include wood elements in the foreground in order to provide depth to his photograph. Viewpoint is the position from which you are looking at the composition. It can have a big impact on your image and affect the message you are trying to convey, the storytelling aspect of your image. As you take more workshop with me, you will notice that I focus a lot on storytelling, whether it is a single image or a series of images. For this reason, I love this image by Chris Burkard, who often includes a man-made element in his landscapes. Beside the sun star as a strong point of interest, there is also a person standing in the landscape, giving a sense of scale and adding to the storytelling aspect of the image. A quick tip here: in order to obtain such a beautiful sun star, you will have to shoot at f16 or above regarding aperture. Let's now talk a little bit about camera settings and some accessories that are nice to have when you're shooting landscapes. When shooting landscape, set your camera to aperture priority, or if you are comfortable, it's always better to shoot fully manual so that you can control both aperture and shutter speed. Set an aperture of f16 or f22 for a large depth of field, and your ISO at the lowest setting possible on your camera, which will be ISO 100 or 200. At aperture very small like f16 or f22, your shutter speed is going to become very slow. So you are going to have to use a tripod most likely. Exposure was covered in detail in a prior workshop, but if you are shooting aperture priority, you can use exposure compensation to correct your exposure. Before we go further, I would like you to make the distinction between sharpness and depth of field. We know that lenses are not uniformly sharp at every aperture, nor at every focusing distance, and in the case of zoom lenses, not equally across the zoom range. And for example, at small apertures, the sharpness of the image deteriorates. We also know that depth of field is a function of aperture, focal length, and focusing distance. So we start seeing how all these parameters interact with each other. So at mid-range apertures, f8 to f11, that's when we will get the greatest sharpness. This is called the sweet spot of the lens. So this is why photographer Dave Morrow decided to take this landscape photograph at an aperture of at f11 because he preferred to have greatest sharpness in his image over the largest depths of field. And he realized that at f11 he achieved an acceptable depth of field for this image. However, smaller apertures of f16 or greater are the ones that's going to help you achieve the greatest depth of field, which is a measure of focus. And focus is the quality of having a clear visual definition. And this is what's going to make your image easier to read for the viewer. And this is also why landscape photographers tend to prefer smaller aperture of f16 or greater. However, in order to minimize loss in image quality, f16 is the smallest recommended aperture for crop sensors, and f22 is the smallest recommended aperture for full frame. In talking about sharpness, I'd like you to look at these three images here and notice how when we move from f8 to f32, we are losing sharpness or quality in the image. This is what I was talking about when I talked about the sweet spot of the lens. f8 to f11, you will get great sharpness. Let's talk a little bit about filters. The polarizing filter offers a variety of useful functions, so you should definitely have one in your camera bag. A polarizing filter effectively reduces reflections and increases contrasts. It makes whites whiter and removes reflections. Many sunglasses these days have polarized lenses, and the effect of a polarizing filter is the same on your photographs. For example, in this image, it gives rich blue skies with striking white clouds and enhances the water scene by removing unwanted reflections. The polarizing filter is most effective when you are standing at 90-degree angle from the sun. It works best actually when the light source is directly overhead, such as midday shooting. A neutral density filter is a dark filter that you can put over the end of your lens. It is like putting sunglasses on your camera, and this means less light gets into your camera and reaches your sensor. You can get ND filters of different strengths in 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10 stop densities. And I've explained what a stop is in a previous workshop. So for a set aperture and to get the right amount of light into the camera and get the correct exposure, the camera will have to leave the shutter open longer and use a slower shutter speed. This is why the ND filter is extremely useful on bright days when you want to use a slow shutter speed and get a creative exposure. You can use, for example, a 6-stop ND filter that will slow your shutter speed by 6 stops, which means that you have 6 times less light entering your camera. And it is what makes the water look all feathery and nice, like on the image on the right-hand side. What happens is that the image on the left is taken without a neutral density filter. The image on the right is taken with a neutral density filter that reduces the amount of light reaching the sensor. Therefore, the shutter speed is a lot slower and allows us to get this cotton candy look in the water. The ND graduated filters are graduated version of ND filters. That means that they have a light reducing layer graduating from the full effect at the top to no effect around 1/3 of the way down the filter. And you have an image on the left-hand side here that shows you ND graduated filters. Their purpose is to cut the exposure in one area of the image to bring it in accordance with a darker area of the image. In the example that we have in front of us, the ND graduated filter allowed the photographer to correctly expose for the foreground while reducing the exposure of the brighter sky with the darker part of the ND filter. The ND graduated filters are available in three main strengths, 1, 2, and 3 stops, which means that it will reduce the light reaching your camera sensor by 1, 2, or 3 stops. They are also available with either a hard or a soft graduated edge. I personally like the B+W filters, but there are many more manufacturers like the Hoya and Lee filters that are very good apparently for ND graduated filters. So the camera focusing tools and depths of field were covered in the first and second Levy Park workshops. Here I will cover some specifics to landscape photography. So Ansel Adams and other well-known photographers recommended placing the focus point about 1/3 of the way between the nearest object that you want to have in focus and the farthest object you want in focus. In practice, this often can be approximated by placing your focus 1/3 of the way up from the bottom of the image. This technique works most of the time if you want to achieve a large depth of field, and that is the one I'm using. So basically, I set my focusing mode for still subject, which is one shoot on Canon or AFS on Nikon, and I set a focus point that is roughly 1/3 into the scene. So the method that is going to help you optimize the best your depth of field is the hyperfocal distance focusing. The hyperfocal distance is the closest distance at which a lens can be focused while keeping objects at infinity acceptably sharp. So let's take an example. Let's say that I'm on my full frame camera at 24mm and f/16. And for the hyperfocal distance table for full frame sensors, I know that my hyperfocal distance is going to be 4 feet. So if we look on the diagram below, my hyperfocal distance is 4 feet. Therefore, the closest the foreground can be to my camera in order to have sharpness from my foreground to the background is 4 divided by 2. So it's 2 feet. So my foreground needs to be at 2 feet from my lens, and I will have a depth of field that will go from 2 feet to infinity, and my closest foreground out 2 feet will be in focus. Let's talk a little bit about lenses for landscape photography. So your first consideration is going to be the focal length. You are going to go for a wide angle lens. You can choose either between a zoom lens or a prime lens. The zoom lens is more versatile, and you can choose like 16 to 35 or 24 to 70mm. It's going to give you a greater reach for your shots. The prime lens, you are going to get sharper images, but you are going to be more limited in how you can frame your shot. And prime lens, you have 28 or 35mm. If you go lower than 28, for example 14mm, you start having obvious distortions. Then your other consideration is the aperture. Landscape photographers usually work mainly at f5.6 to f16, therefore you don't need to invest in a very fast lens. You can opt for a slower lens that is going to be smaller, lighter, but also cheaper. So let's take the example of Chris Burkhardt. He is an American photographer, and he does landscape photography, but also outdoor and travel subjects. So he likes to travel light, and in his bag he's got a 24-70mm and a fixed lens, which is a 35mm. And he says that he shoots about 80 to 90% of the time with these two lenses. He really likes the 24-70mm for its versatility, and it gives him a wide spectrum of reach for all his shots. And he likes the prime lens because usually it's sharper than a zoom lens. Let's move on to the hands-on exercises. So the first exercise, I would like you to experiment at Levy Park or choose a location close to home and shoot some landscapes. Use aperture priority or manual and set your aperture at f16. Use a tripod if your shutter speed is very slow. And compose your shot using the rule of third and one other compositional element that I covered in this presentation. And I would like you to shoot both portrait and landscape and see which one worked the best for your subject. I'd like you also to consider shooting with the sun behind you or at an angle, and set the ISO to the lowest setting possible, like 100 or 200, and shoot earlier in the morning or later in the evening, especially during the summer in Houston. And here we have an example of a landscape image that was taken at Levy Park by one of the students last year and was part of the exhibition, The Views from Levy Park. If you're an advanced photographer, please feel free to look for a dramatic landscape and experiment with filters and slow shutter speed to show movement in the water and or clouds. Try using hyperfocal distance for optimum depth of field. In the second exercise, I would like you to include man-made elements in your landscape photographs. You can experiment at Levy Park and use the same settings and composition guidelines as in exercise number 1. Include both man-made and natural elements in your image to give a sense of place. And make the man-made or the natural element the focal point of your image. Here we have an example of an image taken at Levy Park by a participant from 2019, and this image was part of the online exhibition's Views from Levy Park. As usual, you can follow us at Levy Park Houston and at HCP Online. If you are taking images as part of this workshop and you would like to share them online, do not forget to hashtag Levy Park and hashtag HCP Online. Please do not forget to join me on Saturday morning for our live Q&A on Zoom. We can also review some of your images at that time. The information for the Zoom session is on the Houston Center for Photography website under Education, Levy Park Workshops. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I will see you on Saturday. Goodbye.